And it's also before he's written any of his letters or books. Okay? So that's the person we're going to hear from today. Also, if you think about it, this is probably before anything was written for the New Testament in this time period. In 46, probably nothing had been written yet. Okay? So that's the time period we're talking about. And today we have Rus Anderson as the Apostle Paul.
I was born with the name Saul after Israel's first king. Unfortunately, it turned out that one of the characteristics that I shared with our first king was a raging temper. I lost my temper a lot. I was an angry young man. Later in my life, my friends started calling me by my Roman name, Paul. And I think that was to help differentiate my life from the man who persecuted Christians, from the man who led people to become Christians. I think my best friend and publicity agent, Barnabas, had a lot to do with that. At least he claims he led the campaign for my name change. You know, he could encourage people to do just about anything, so that's probably true. But before I tell you my story, I got to let you in on something. I got to let you know that I look at this audience and I'm full of envy. I'm pretty envious, not because you're good looking, which you are, not because you smell good, which you do, and not because you have a lot of earthly goods, and probably you do, especially compared to what we had in my time. But I'm envious for a lot of you because I look out and I see a lot of eyeglasses. Eyeglasses weren't even invented for centuries after me. In fact, I think you guys have a doctor here who specializes in eyes. I certainly wish Luke would have had that ability when he was around. But as often happened in my time, I started losing my eyesight in my 30s. And my eyes started going down, and it got so bad that I had to have people write for me and read for me. So scrolls were way too precious to waste on my handwriting, which had to get really big for me to be able to read it. So I had a lot of people who read for me and wrote for me. Good thing that I had memorized a good part of the Old Testament when I was younger, so I didn't have to have my own copies of those. I also want to point out that you don't really know very much about me at this point in my life. I've not established any churches yet. I haven't gone on any missionary journeys. I haven't written any books or letters. And I haven't gone through that unpleasant maturing process of the beatings and the shipwrecks and the starvation and the illness and the rejection and all those things that I am told I'm going to have to go through. You know, I've made a lot of progress, but Barnabas assures me I've got plenty to do. I've got a long way to go. Although I was a Roman citizen, I was born in the city of Tarsus. When I was young, my parents sent me to Israel, to Jerusalem, to study at the feet of Gamaliel. Not just anybody. Gamaliel, one of the greatest rabbis of all time. And I was really wanted the intellectual challenge. I thought that was kind of cool, but to be honest, I was probably too young to leave my family at the time. And as a result, I think I kind of became resentful. And eventually I became angry. Probably was the angriest young man in Israel at the time. And it seemed like no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't please my parents. Doesn't seem how smart I thought I wasn't smart enough for my teachers. And it didn't seem like no matter how much I tried to follow the laws of Moses and to do what God wanted me to do, it wasn't enough to satisfy God, at least in my mind. And it was this vicious cycle. And I was frustrated, and I was angry, and I had this low self-esteem. And perhaps some of you may have experienced something like that in your life, where you just never feel like you're good enough. So that's why Christians were such a perfect target for me. In my mind, at least, they seemingly broke God's law and the laws of Moses to the point that they were blaspheming God. So I had a perfect justification for taking out my anger on them. For the first time in my life, the harder I tried to do something, the more famous I became. And the Christians, the more I persecuted the Christians, the more approval I got from my peers. And the more my anger was fed. And I felt like I had a purpose by vicious acts of violence resulted in fame and righteousness, at least in my feeling for myself. And I perfected the art of having Christians respond to my questions in such a way that at least seemingly they were blaspheming God. And then I was justified in exercising capital punishment and sending them to the stoning pit. Christians all over the world began to fear me. Me. They were afraid of me. I had a purpose. I was succeeding. There's one thing that you have in your time that I got to admit I really like. Country Western music. I really like country. Now, we had music back then, but it wasn't anything like this. This is good stuff, right? And I think that my life was kind of like one of your country Western songs, because I think I was looking for love in all the wrong places. I didn't know it at the time. Then I saw the light. I mean, literally, I saw the light. I was on my way to Damascus. I had gotten permission from the high priest to go to Damascus, and I was going to hunt down Christians there. I was so excited. I was finally able to take my passion outside of Jerusalem and go and hunt down Christians in Damascus. And I was in a hurry. I wanted to get there. So I figured that my companions and I could travel that 200 miles in about 10 days. We were booking it. 20 miles a day is pretty fast for us. I realize you guys can travel that in no time in a car these days, but that was pretty fast for us. And the closer I got to Damascus, the angrier I got. And I was just excited because I was going to put an end to this thing. Man, these Christians were spreading like wildfires in Oklahoma in the spring. They were going all over the place. When we were just on the outskirts of Damascus, getting close, all of a sudden, whammo! This light, this bright, brilliant light, hit me with such intensity that it drove me to my knees. It was such a powerful light that it knocked my companions away from me. And I was standing there on my knees, and I heard this voice, this tender, soft voice, almost in a whisper. And he said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I knew in a heartbeat, that the Christians were right and I was wrong. In a moment, I knew that. Have you ever been in a situation where you just feel like you have to say something and you end up saying the most stupid thing you've ever said in your life? Well, that was me. I was about to say the most dumb, stupid thing I've ever said. I looked up, I said, "Who are you, Lord?" Like I didn't know, right? And I thought, oh boy, here's coming. I'm not going to get it now. Then his voice got even more gentle, even kinder. He said, I'm Jesus. I'm the one you're persecuting. Now get up and go into the city and you'll be told what you got to do. So I got up. The first thing I noticed is I couldn't see. I was blind. So my companions had to help me into the city. I was blind for 3 days. I didn't eat anything. I didn't drink anything. All I did all those 3 days was just pray, God, what do you want me to do? Where do you want me to go? I didn't realize it at the time, but God had been preparing me for my next step in life my entire life. And across town, he was preparing another guy to help me, a guy named Ananias. Now, this is not the Ananias who was the husband of Sapphira, who was killed by the Holy Spirit for lying. This is Ananias of Damascus, who was a disciple of Jesus. And in the vision, the Lord told Ananias to go to a straight street and look for Saul, because I was staying in a house on straight, it was a straight street, but the street's name was Straight. So anyways, that's where I was staying. And so Ananias was going to come, and he was told to come and lay his hands on me and restore my sight. He was understandably a little bit scared because, as I said, my reputation had gone quite a distance. And he questioned the Lord. He said, I don't want to go. Then the Lord declared my entire future to Ananias. He told him, this man is my chosen instrument to carry my word to the Gentiles and to their kings and to the children of Israel, and I'll show him how much he has to suffer for me. So, braving my reputation, Ananias came to the house and he laid hands on me. At that moment, I was filled with the Holy Spirit. I'll never forget that feeling. I'll never forget what it felt like. And then these things like scales fell from my eyes and I could see. And I was baptized. Immediately baptized. Because that's what Ananias told me, that's what Jesus wanted me to do. And I wasn't going to argue the doctrinal significance of baptism. Jesus wanted me to do it. I was going to do it. Right then. It was enough for me that Jesus asked me to do it. And then the Lord began to show me how I was going to suffer on his behalf. But you know what? That was okay. Because from then on, I was a slave of Jesus. And slaves take on their identity of their master, so if Jesus had to suffer for me, I had no problem suffering for him. Now, do you remember how the apostles got to spend 3 years with Jesus? Well, the Holy Spirit decided that I needed to do the same thing before I started my preaching career. So, Andy probably thought I needed to distance myself a little bit from that reputation I had as a persecutor of Christians. Maybe let a little time go so that would soften a little bit. So he led me into the desert, and just like the first apostles, I got to spend 3 years with Jesus. 3 years of revelation straight from Jesus. For the first time, I began to understand how the Old Testament scriptures pointed to Jesus and how all men can be reconciled to God. I learned that salvation came through faith and grace, not by following the law, not by making sure that you did everything the Old Testament told us to do, not by checking off a bunch of blocks, but by God's love and his grace. Oh, that felt good. That was such a time of peace and comfort in my life. And I really just wished I could stay there forever. But Jesus had an entirely different plan in mind for me. So back to Damascus I go, and I began to start sharing the gospel. After 3 years with Jesus, I began to understand how those scriptures pointed to him, and I understood them in a completely new way. And I already knew how to debate. Oh, I could debate. I learned how to debate from the best of the rabbis. So now I turned that skill on them, and I used scriptures to really explain how Jesus was the man. How this all led to Jesus. So I knew I could destroy any argument that they had, and anyone who wanted to argue with me about this, they were in trouble. They were not going to be able to stand. And it made those Jews in Damascus so mad that they tried to kill me. How ironic. The ones who asked me to come to help them kill Christians, were now wanting to kill me. So how ironic it was that the Christians that I'd actually come to kill had to let me down in a basket through the wall to get me out of the city, away from the wounded Jews. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if some of those Christians thought that maybe they should just let the Jews stone me. You know, kind of like God let Stephen be stoned. Oh, Father, forgive me. That's still a painful memory. So, I returned to Jerusalem because I needed to meet with the other apostles, and I needed to make some amends. So I got to spend 15 days with Peter. Boy, that was a great time. And we developed a lifetime friendship, although we learned that our personalities were a little bit different. And we clashed a bit. You know, I thought he thought I was an arrogant, educated Pharisee, and I thought he was blunt to a fault. We were probably both right, at least at this point in our life. But I also got to meet James. Wow. What a guy. A man who had this crushing amount of humility and compassion and obedience. He must have learned that from his parents, just like Jesus did. Understandably, many of the Christians there were afraid of me. I mean, come on, the last time a lot of them saw me, I was consenting to the stoning of Stephen. So they had pretty good reason to be afraid of me. But for some unknown reason, my new acquaintance, Barnabas, he vouched for me. And so slowly the people began to accept me. I've always thought that Ananias used his influence with Barnabas to get him to vouch for me, but neither of them will really admit it. It wasn't too long, though, until the Hellenistic Jews in Jerusalem started to get angry with me as well because of my arguments and my ability to preach these devastating arguments against what they wanted to say that the scriptures believe, and the arguments about Jesus that they just couldn't stand against. And so they threatened to kill me. Wow, how times change. You know, just 4 years before, I was asking them for papers to go to Damascus and kill Christians, and now they're after my neck. So one time I was in the temple, and the Lord appeared to me, and he said, I want you to leave Jerusalem immediately. And he said he's going to send me far away to the Gentiles. Now, I'm no mathematician, but it seemed like a pattern was beginning to develop. You see, so the Christians in Jerusalem sent me to Philip at Caesarea, where there were fewer Jews. And then they sent me on to my hometown in Tarsus, where there were even fewer Jews. And it seemed that once I got out of the way, the church in Jerusalem had several years of peace and continued growth. And so I spent most of my time evangelizing in the areas of Syria and Cilicia. But again, my caustic personality was a constant hindrance. It seemed like I had taken all that anger that I had built up, and I was now using it to argue against Judaism and to argue for Christianity. But I still had some rough edges that needed to be knocked off a little bit. One day I was enjoying a cold glass lemonade at my house in Tarsus, and I got a knock at the door. So I went to the door. It was my old friend Barnabas was standing there. And he said he wanted me to come join him back in Antioch. I think he was just trying to encourage me a little bit when he told me that the believers there were anxious for me to come back because, you know I didn't have the most touchy-feely persona. But I was ready to go start work with Barnabas again. I was excited about the opportunity to work with him again, and I figured that practicing on the people in Antioch was a good place to start. So I went back with Barnabas to Antioch, and with Barnabas running interference for me, I got to stay there for a whole year before the Christians finally decided it was time for me to go again and sent me back to Jerusalem. This time was a little different. This time Agabus had a prophecy about an upcoming famine. So the Antioch brothers generously took together a great collection and chose me and Barnabas to take this collection back to Jerusalem for the Christians there. I was eager. I was, because I did want to get back to Jerusalem. I wanted to improve my friendship and my relationship with the apostles and James, and to get their approval. This was a big one. I wanted to get their approval to take the gospel and evangelize the Gentiles throughout Asia. And Barnabas and I took my new assistant, a guy named Titus. You might know about Titus. You're going to hear about him later. But it was during this famine of Claudius, the people of Jerusalem, Jerusalem were suffering greatly. And it's from this famine, we know from this famine, that this period is about 16 years after Jesus' resurrection. So in Jerusalem, as we discussed the evangelization of the Gentiles, we agreed that the new Christians did not have to follow the law of Moses. So as an example, Titus, who was a Gentile, didn't have to be circumcised. Believe me, that was a great relief to Titus. But it was also a relief to me, because it meant that now presenting the message to Gentiles was going to be a lot easier. It would be a lot easier to sell. Peter and the remaining apostles gave me their approval to evangelize the Gentiles and sent me back to Antioch with instructions to do the very thing I wanted to do anyways, to go evangelize the Gentiles. Barnabas brought his nephew John Mark with us. We hoped that he might learn from Titus how to be a faithful assistant, although John Mark seemed a lot like a spoiled rich kid to me. You know, I had heard he may have had an unpleasant encounter with Jesus when he was younger, so I wasn't real sure how much he might stick. I wasn't sure if he was really going to be able to hang with us. Also, some weeks ago, back in Antioch, they were anxiously helping us on our way. They gathered a nice contribution. It wasn't too long before we were ready to go. I got to admit, I'm kind of hesitant about taking John Mark on this journey, but I owe Barnabas so much that I'm not complaining. Well, not openly complaining out loud, although I am pouting a little bit, but we'll take the guy with us and we'll see how it goes. Besides, I'm ready to go evangelize the Gentiles, and I'm ready to go. So I started to realize, though, how the Lord had been surrounding me with people critical to my mission and critical to my well-being. You've already met some of them: Peter, Barnabas, Philip, Titus, and maybe even John Mark, although I'm not real sure about that one yet. I was sorry that Stephen wasn't able to join me, but I was going to take his message, and somehow I knew that that would make him happy. I smile when I think of how Luke will write the story about me. Being a doctor, I'm sure he will make things look orderly and neat. As a Christian, I'm sure he will show all the Christians as the good guys in the white hats who always win in the end. But let me promise you, that hasn't always been that way to this point. And I don't suspect it will be anytime in the future. See, victors get to write the story, and we Christians, at least in history, are far from the victors. At this time, though, the Romans hardly know who the Christians are. They don't hardly know we exist. Even Israel is just a tiny speck in the Roman Empire, and the Jews are some unimportant irritant to the Romans. They're not that significant. And in Jerusalem and in the rest of Israel, Judaism was the only important thing. All of our lives as Jews revolved around following the law of Moses the best way we knew how, making sure and dot all those I's and crossing all those T's and getting all the laws in. To the Jews, Christians were the worst kind of blasphemers. They completely misrepresent the character of God, and they even worship some human as God. That was the worst sin of all. It was nearly impossible for any of the common people to completely understand this, but the Jewish leaders have an additional problem. See, if the Christians are right, that means the Jewish leaders are wrong. This not only presents a theological problem for them, but it is a threat against the authority and the wealth of the leaders. The more the Christians grow in numbers and reputation, the more Judaism is threatened. Whether in Israel or in other countries, the arguments are growing angrier and more confused. They boil down to about two basic questions. The first question is, will Christians become part of Judaism, or will the Jews become a diminishing part of Christianity? Since all of the early Christians were Jews from birth, it would seem most likely that the new Christians will need to become part of Judaism. That seemed the most logical thing. But the second question was this: will non-Jewish people be allowed to become Christians if they don't follow the laws of Moses? That was the big question. That was huge, because, see, when the Holy Spirit made it clear that non-Jewish people should become Christians, he didn't really make it clear whether or not they ought to have to follow the law of Moses to do it. He didn't put that down in book, chapter, and verse like we like to have. And this is critically important, because if the Gentile Christians don't have to follow the law of Moses, then it is increasingly obvious that the Jewish Christians don't have to follow them either. That was a huge, huge threat to the Jewish leadership at the time. It's been more than 15 years since Pentecost, and the Jews have persecuted Christians in Israel and in other locations throughout the world. Frankly, it is a chaotic and unsure time for us all. We don't know it yet, but ultimately the question will disappear for a very unexpected reason. Well, at least unexpected to the Jews. We Christians will be prepared for it because Jesus told us to expect it. But in AD 70, the Romans will completely destroy the temple in Jerusalem. And they will expel all the Jews from Jerusalem, at least the ones they don't kill. And so when the Jews cannot sacrifice or celebrate at the temple, the central part of their religion, their system of worship will have to be completely modified. It'll have to be changed in a substantial manner. Without the income of the temple, the Jewish leaders will lose their economic power, as well as some of their control over the people and their ability to threaten the Romans. So at the same time, the Christians will be growing quickly in numbers and economic power. It will almost be overnight that the persecution from the Jews stops. And that's the good news. The bad news will be that the Romans will soon start taking notice of the Christians, and they begin to persecute us. But that happens many years down the road, way after the ending of Dr. Luke's book. So this catches you up to the time when Barnabas and I and John Mark and Titus are about to start on our first missionary journey into the Gentiles. And I can hardly wait to tell you about that trip. was all planned, by the way.
Yeah. Good job, Russ. Thank you so much for that. So a few quick questions before we run out of time. First of all, the name change from Saul to Paul. Do you notice how we portrayed it a couple of times already? As just being a natural thing because it was a Roman name and a Jewish name. That's not what some of us were taught growing up. So that's one of the things that we portrayed. How about the 3 years that Paul was with Jesus by himself? That's not in Acts. So where did we get it from?
I was wondering that myself.
There you go.
I couldn't even get past that.
I couldn't either.
Couldn't get past
That's
that,
my
right?
first question.
That's because we weren't taught that. Because when we study Acts verse by verse, by golly, it's not there. It's in Galatians 1. In Galatians 1, it's clear that he gets 3 years of time of revelation from Jesus. And if you piece together the other things, you find out it's pretty convincing that it happens right after he's converted. Okay, not some distant time in the future. That's why we portray it that way, and I think if you studied it, you would come to that conclusion. But it's in Galatians 1. So that's important because the other apostles spent 3 years with Jesus. So now Paul can say, I spent 3 years with Jesus. Okay? Puts him on a plane later when they have the arguments about whether Paul's an apostle or not. That's one of his pieces of evidence that he can use. Okay?
You mean revelation from Jesus?
Revelation.
Not
What did I say?
person to person.
No,
That's what you said.
yeah, okay, so let's talk about that. It says in Galatians it's a revelation from Jesus, which some people that take to mean he got it immediately, like just bam. But I think you can make a case he's 3 years in the desert, and the revelation is a teaching over time. So that is some people take it one way or another. So thank you for pointing that out.
I mean, but not walking with him.
He was walking, I think, spiritually. He does talk about getting caught up to the third heaven, which we're not going to go into, but that's the sort of thing. So that's where the piece of evidence comes from, where we took that in the story. But really, what I wanted to get to, I think, is the main point, is that everybody needs to understand that at this point in time, it's still unclear how the Gentiles are going to fit in Christianity, because most of the Christians were Jews from birth. They still followed the laws of Moses, and they expected new converts to Christianity. Many of them expect them to follow the laws of Moses. Okay. This is a big deal, and it is very unclear at this point in time which way it's going to go. One of the reasons it's unclear is because when Paul goes back on the famine visit that Russ ended up with and talks to the apostles and to James, he thinks he has the green light to go to the Gentiles and teach the way he wants to. That's not necessarily what everybody else thought that they had told Paul. Okay? So have you ever been in a situation where your boss said for you to go do something, and you think you heard it one way and he meant it another way? I've lost jobs over that. So I'm really familiar with that. Okay? It's that situation now is there's a big faction of the Christians who believe one way, and Paul is trying to take it a whole different way. So when we start seeing the missionary journeys happen, that's going to be part of the reason why they happen the way they happen. Okay, it's to settle these questions. And then in future lessons we'll see why. And then the last thing I want to point out, and it's come back again and again, temple gets destroyed in 70 AD. Okay? We are almost halfway between Pentecost and the destruction of the temple in time. Not quite halfway, but close. Okay? So God is making plans for this transition to happen because he knows Judaism is not going to be a big problem anyway. But he needs to make this transition. Okay? That makes sense to everybody? Okay, we have a couple of minutes and for questions, and I think we have a couple of minutes, Kim? Yes. we do.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the wardrobe, the hats and stuff, you know, we've seen all the costumes and stuff.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about the fashion of the day?
Wow. The fashion of the day, and I want to throw a shout out to my friend Deb Nelson, who is a good friend of Shannon's. Deb Nelson graciously made the costumes. So Deb chose the fashions primarily on what patterns were available and what material she could pick out. So the fashion that we're talking about is Deb Nelson's choice. And I think she did a great job. I'm really pleased. Yeah.
I'll just add, I know Dr. Luke got fine linen, James not so much.
That was the funny thing. Deb is a real student of the Bible. And so she really used the costumes in some real interesting ways. And they are specifically made for the character and the people who are playing those characters. And that is one point. I don't know if you can hear that over there, but the character like Luke has really nice material. When we get to James, who theoretically is a very poor person, he gets really shoddy material. That's on purpose.
So was Paul's vision improved after his blindness was over? Because he went, his eyesight was getting bad in his 30s.
Well, and the idea about Paul having bad vision comes from one of the other letters where he says, "See, this is my own handwriting, it's large." So the idea from that is his vision was gone. And since I lost mine in my 30s, I figured he did too.
So when his blindness was over, his vision was not all.
He talks about his large handwriting afterwards. So I don't know that. Yeah, actually, when he was blind, he was probably more in his 20s. Is my guess. Although we don't have proof for that, it seems like he was still a young person at that time. But that's another example of it. We take facts that are in other books and piece it together. A lot of people think Paul's vision was his thorn in the flesh that he talks about. A lot of us don't believe that, but that is something that a lot of people do.
Something that I always forget is when he was blinded, he knew. He knew.
He knew.
He knew all along. He knew. He didn't have to sort it out. He knew.
Yeah, that's what I think. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Thank you guys again. Appreciate it.
Good job.